Welcome to the How Did They Do It Real Estate Podcast. Have you ever wondered how people succeed in real estate and what steps they took to get there? If so, this podcast is for you. Your hosts, Sayla and Eileen Prack, interview top experts in the real estate community to share with you their real estate journey and how they achieved massive success. Our goal is to provide you with valuable real estate resources and to help you apply it to your own real estate goal. Welcome to today's episode of the How Did They Do It Real Estate Podcast. I'm your host, Eileen Prack, and today our guest is Patrick Menefee. And Patrick is a life and business coach who works with high-income professionals to create freedom and purpose beyond the 9 to 5 to 65 grinds. He began building his real estate portfolio in 2019 and quickly grew it after picking up 21 rental doors and 2 flips in the first year. He decided it was time to leave corporate America. And since then, he's flipped a number of properties, built and shut down a flipping business, invested in all types of rental properties, and even bought a small business on the path to finding his calling and helping people fulfill their potential. So Patrick, I know it's been a little while since we last connected, but I'm super excited to actually have you on the show now. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me almost a year after our initial connection. So it's been a while.
Never too late. It's never too late.
Yeah, perfect. Speaks to you guys and how well everything's going.
So Patrick, can you share a little bit more about your background and how you got started with real estate?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've had the entrepreneurial bug my entire life, ever since I was a kid. I grew up seeing my mom, who was very successful in Mary Kay. She had a big business with, I'd see her go to her meetings every Monday. And from an early age, I just saw what entrepreneurship was to her. And I saw that she was at all my baseball games. I saw that she was at every school event. She was always very involved. And so I didn't know it at the time, but I very much latched onto that. And I started a little business when I was a kid with her and stuff like that. So I knew that eventually more and more that was where I wanted to go. And naturally, as a next step after I left college, I joined the Army because it's a real incubator of creativity and entrepreneurship. But that's not true. Once I left, though, it was a good learning experience over that time. And once I left, I knew that I wanted to go the business owner route. I wanted to go the entrepreneur route. I had no idea what that meant. And so I moved into consulting. Consulting for me was an avenue to learn. It was an avenue to meet people and make connections. It was an avenue to identify different industries. I didn't have any particular industry that I really cared about or knew anything about. And it was an opportunity to learn about the corporate world in a variety of different ways. And so I used that as my avenue to, what I thought at least, to build some type of business. It was an avenue in a different way. And that's when I found real estate and didn't use any of those things that I just mentioned. But I stumbled into real estate more than anything, started to realize the power of it. I bought my first house with a VA loan, put no money down, got a check at closing, which was exciting. And initially that was my plan, was I was just going to, use a VA loan every year and buy an owner occupied house and kind of snowball it. And then a couple of months into that, I thought, that's kind of stupid and that's going to take way too long. So let's go a little bit faster. And in September, this is back in 2019, in September, I bought my first actual rental property, which was a quad. And then a week later, I closed on another place, which was 6 units. And then over the next 13 months, just went crazy and bought 21 different doors, bought a couple of flips. And 13 months after closing on the first property was when I ended up leaving my job. So once I realized the power of real estate and what I could do with it, it didn't make sense to do anything but dive headfirst into it. So took a long winding route to get there, and then since then there's been a lot of pivots too. But
when you said you started a business when you were small with your mom, can I ask what business you started?
Yeah. Technically you could probably call it pirating CDs. But realistically, my mom had training CDs from events that they did, and there were a bunch of them that were discontinued. And so the people on her team wanted access to them, the ones that you could no longer get. And she had been around forever. She had all of them. And so I created a business copying the ones that could no longer be purchased. And so I had I had my desktop computer, and I would go to Office Depot on Sundays and get free CDs with a mail-in rebate. And I had a little press that I would put labels on. I would print out labels for them, and I'd put them in little mailing packages, and I'd go pedal my bicycle down to the post office and I'd drop them all off. And then I'd get $2.50 checks in the mail for each one that I sold. And I'd pedal my bike back to the bank and I would deposit my checks at the bank. So that was my CD copying and creation, and distribution was my first business.
It's interesting how times have changed now, where like CDs, they don't even have CD players in cars anymore.
Yeah. I was looking at how I could, take a desktop tower that was this big and I could plug 5 different CD burners into it to make it go as fast as possible. And now I can't remember the last time I saw a CD. Guess that business is obsolete.
So Patrick, when you first bought your home and you said 13 months later, you were able to leave your job, I think I misunderstood, or maybe I just didn't get it clarified a little bit, but were you still using the VA loans to purchase into the quad and then continue building up from there? Or like, how are you able to finance all of that?
So I quickly pivoted from that strategy. And so the rest of them, no, they weren't VA loans. They were all small multifamily deals, except for the flips. And so the first one, I put 25% down and I did that all on my own. And I basically, you talk about, or you hear about burning the boats. And that's basically what I did. I had from the past, I think I was 30 or 31 at the time. And I had built up over my adult life, $85,000 in my stock portfolio. And so I sold all of that, and I didn't ever have a 401k because I didn't want to have money that I couldn't touch forever. So I took that $85,000. I ended up putting half of it into that first deal, and I put the other half into the next 4 deals. And the other 4 deals that I did for the other 16, 17 doors, whatever it was, were with partners. And so I would find partners, friends, coworkers, other people that would bring the money to the deal, and I would run the entire deal. I'd find it, I'd manage it, I'd coordinate the rehab and the renovation and putting tenants in and all that kind of stuff. So that was put a bunch of capital into the first one, realized how unsustainable that was if I wanted to actually grow and scale. And so all the other ones, partnerships, plus I used a variety of financing from conventional mortgage to hard money to commercial loan. I think those are the 3. I'd probably use something else in there. I don't know, but those are the main ways. So
can you share a little bit about the process behind the stock portfolio that you had, and then looking at what you were able to do with those funds to be able to leave your job in 13 months? Because that's a pretty quick transition. And like, did you set up a plan in the very beginning and you said, these are how many doors I need to be able to get to be able to compensate for the W-2 job that you're working in real estate? So what did that all look like in the very beginning when you made that decision?
Well, as far as the plan was sprint. As far as the very specifics of the plan, I didn't have a lot outside of that. It was partner, find as many deals as possible to provide cash flow and go that route until I ran out of money and continued to replenish that. Where that changed a lot. So I guess there's 2 parts to it. The first part is when I first got started, that was exactly the path that I just mentioned. I had the capital available. It was a very, very, very big focus on my cash on cash return. And how can I maximize that? How can I make every single dollar go as far as humanly possible? Then after a little bit of time, after I got through my 5th deal and I realized that the 4 deals that I did with partners were all with different partners. And that created its own set of challenges to where every single person wanted something different. Every single deal was structured differently. And it led to a lot of headaches. And as I looked at 2 other deals that I was going under contract for with 2 additional partners, some of the requirements that they had and some of the things that they wanted were absurd. And it made me realize in that moment that wasn't the way that I needed to go. And so at that point, that was when I started getting into flipping. And I realized that there's a different way to go about this. And I'll go down this path for a second, but this is where I think people can really rethink how they approach their quote unquote financial freedom, at least at the basic level. Because what I thought and what a lot of people think is, okay, I've got this income. And I was working in the banking industry, making a nice 6-figure salary. And I had this income. And so as a result, I need to create enough passive income to replace this income. And that means that my time frame was forever. It was a really long time, which makes it very daunting. And what I realized instead was 2 things. One was stop focusing on income and start focusing on expenses. And so while I was making a 6-figure salary, my actual expenses were $4,000 to $5,000 a month. And by focusing on just creating enough money to cover my expenses, that is the basic level of financial freedom, is I can pay my bills. And so that was shift number 1. Now that cut my the actual target of income that I needed to make, that cut that in half or more. The second part, though, was this myth that all of it has to be passive income. And so I realized that when I quit my job, I actually, to this day, I've never had the passive income to fully cover all my expenses. It's been a combination of passive income plus active income. And so that was the second part that allowed me to quit 13 months later. Was I had a basic level of cash flow from those deals, but I also had flips. And so I had a delta of probably $2,000 a month in my cash flow versus my expenses. And so that just meant that I needed to create, if I think about that on a longer scale with flipping houses, if I can flip a house and make $24,000 in profit, that covers that $2,000 a month for 12 months. And now I've got a year's worth of runway, and I don't need every single dollar of it to be cash flow. So that was the big kind of turning point in my strategy. Was I'll keep building cash flow and narrow that gap. At the same time, I'll continue to create active income to create layers on top of that so that I can extend my runway. So then every time I sold a flip, that extended my runway another few months. Now then I added expenses and stuff like that on top of it for the business. So it gets a little bit different there. But if you can change those two things, that's what really helped me be able to leave, because otherwise it would have taken forever.
When you looked at your expenses, were you looking at just the bare minimum to get you from month to month, or like what your minimum, what your expenses was on a minimum basis to be able to cover that piece of it? Or did you also add in some additional reserves on top of it when you're doing an analysis of what your expenses on a month to month would look like?
It's a really good question. I did both. I had a couple of different ways that I approached it. And actually, it's funny that the timing of this, I'm working on by the time this podcast comes out on my website, I'll have a tool that the one that I use that someone can download for free. I'll make sure that it's out by then. But when I started looking at my expenses in that way, I decided I'm an analytical person. And so budgeting, I always hated budgeting because I'd get super in the weeds of, okay, is this food or is this fast food? Or is this there's so many different categories. And so then I would just say, screw it, and I would stop. When I was getting ready to quit, I broke that down very simply. I said, I have two buckets. I've got my subscriptions and recurring expenses that happen every month. They're on auto pay. And I've got my non-recurring expenses that are just my living expenses. And so I can, they are what they are. I can now, knowing this list of money that comes out every month, I can attack that and I can start reducing that, because there is plenty of stuff in there that's wasteful. And so that was part one, was I'll cut out the waste. It doesn't mean that I'm living on breadcrumbs. It's stuff that I truly don't need, or I'll negotiate and bring down the cost of some other things, or I'm paying way more for something than I need to, something like that. And so that brings down that expense level. The second part is on my monthly expenses that aren't recurring, but things like food and stuff like that. I created a weekly target for it that in some ways I cut back a lot, but a lot of it was just cutting back, not to bare bones, but cutting back stuff that was just a waste. And it was an awareness thing. And so when I started tracking it, I literally got to the point where every single transaction, when I would swipe my credit card on a weekly basis, I would write down the transaction and the amount. And so I knew at the end of the week how much I had spent. And just by that act of awareness, I noticed all sorts of stuff that I was wasting money on. I noticed that every time I went to the grocery store, I would grab a drink or a snack or something like that I didn't need, that I could wait until I got home 5 minutes later. Same thing at the gas station. Every time I filled up for gas, I would go buy something, and all of that. They're little things. And I definitely don't subscribe to the idea of the lattes that you drink are what's holding you back from financial freedom. I don't believe that.
Avocado toast.
But yeah, exactly. But I do think if you're spending money on stuff that you absolutely don't need, I didn't need to buy a drink at the grocery store. I had a drink at home. I was just being lazy and it was in front of me, so I grabbed it. And so the awareness changed my expenses. So that was to answer the question on how I cut back and whether it was bare minimum. It wasn't bare minimum. It was just eliminating waste. And then on top of that, I also built in a buffer. So I also needed to have not only the runway that I talked about, I wanted to have, I think it was 9 months worth of runway of the difference between my expenses and my income. I also wanted an emergency fund that was 6 to 8 months of expenses that I just wouldn't touch whatsoever. No matter what happened, I wasn't touching those funds unless it was an absolute emergency. And then I knew going into it that I've got these 9 months of runway, also because I'm not spending the bare minimum. I'm not living on a minimal budget every month, that if I did start getting into month 4 or 5 and things weren't looking good, I could cut my expenses back further and I could extend my runway a little bit further. So those were kind of the ways that I went about it. But I definitely didn't cut down to absolutely nothing and live in my parents' basement or anything like that. I kept a pretty good lifestyle the whole way, but I just changed my approach to it.
I like that approach. I think this is the first time I've heard somebody break out their expenses by recurring and non-recurring expenses, because when you break it out in that way, you think about it that way, and then kind of take those two larger buckets and then look at the non-recurring bucket and kind of breaking that a little bit further. It makes it a lot easier to manage your expenses, because these are the ones where you can actually cut down and really dive into it a little bit more. And so I think that's a pretty unique approach that this is the first time I've heard. So I like that. I like that approach.
Yeah, thank you. It worked. I mean, and it was very different, but it was just kind of out of necessity. And I just kind of looked at everything and I was like, you know what? I've tried a million different budgeting techniques and none of them work for me. I don't like them, or they work for a little bit. And part of it was just an experiment. I was like, you know what? Let's see if I can survive off of $400 a week between gas, food, everything else. And if when I got to that point, there were plenty of times that I was cutting back a lot, but also I realized that if I go out on the weekend and I'm going to the bars and spending a bunch of money, like that is that's not serving me to get towards my goals in the first place. B, that also eats up the majority of my money. If I change my habits a little bit and I do things that are serving and building towards my goals and the future that I was clear on at that point, it makes it a lot easier to do that. So it was a lot of experimentation too. But I realized that when I tried it that way, I actually didn't need to spend that much money, because I could spend more time internally focusing on myself and building out my business and building out my habits and that type of thing.
So once you evaluate your expenses, you've broken up into these buckets, you understand and you realize what are some of the excess things that you can start cutting out of your expenses and reducing those aspects of it down. How do you start building up your cash flow then to cover that? When you were looking at to build up that side of it, were you looking at the cash flow just to cover your recurring expenses? Or what did you know what was the balance between your passive income versus your active, and how could that be sustainable?
It was, at the time, the goal was make as much passive income as possible and use active income to make up whatever the difference was. I didn't have a target of X percentage versus Y. It was really ultimately my criteria when I quit my job came down to three things. And first of all, for anybody that's listening, that's thinking about quitting or that has some date in the future and they just think it's going to happen at some point, do yourself a favor and set a date and set a target. And then after you set a target, ask yourself why that target. Because I very distinctly remember it was middle of July in 2019. And I had set a target for April 1st. And this will tie into your question, I promise. And I'll come back to it. But I set that target for April 1st. And I was like, at this moment, what is going to be different on April 1st than today? And I couldn't come up with anything in particular. And so then I said, okay, then if I had the money today, I did from a deal that I had just done, but what would I need to do to quit my job? And so that's where I set the three criteria in place. One was I wanted to have the reserves that I talked about, the emergency fund. Two was I wanted to have the runway to cover the difference between my expenses and my income. And then third was I wanted stability in my financial picture. So I had one of my rentals had a big rehab that was in the process of refinancing, and I wanted that to be stabilized. Oh, and I also, as a part of that, the fourth part, forgot number four. Number four was the important one, which is besides all the stability in the reserves, number four was I needed to have an active source of income that I knew I could get recurring income from. And so I had a flip in progress. I had two flips in progress, actually. And so that was my final piece of criteria was I need one of these flips to be on the market before I quit, because now I know I've got these reserves in place. I've got this runway in place. I've got the experience of all these deals. I know I can go find more deals. Also, I know that this just hit the market. So worst case, 3-4 months from now, I'll have the cash from this too. But I knew I had that chain of recurring income that would make up that gap between my passive and my expenses.
So once you hit that date and everything kind of fell into place on what you were expecting and the plans that you had put into motion, on that April 1st date, did you have reservations and did you think about oh, what if something could have happened? Am I making the right decisions? Was there still a lot of that fear that came with making that decision of leaving, even though you had all these things that you had planned out already in motion and set in place?
Surprisingly, not at all. And it actually wasn't, to speak to that exact point, I ended up leaving on October 30th instead of April 1st, because when I became super clear on what my criteria was, as soon as I hit that criteria, there was no reason to stay. And there was also no fear, because I knew going into it that I had all of this stuff in place. Now, the curveball that got thrown in there was I was putting in my 2 weeks notice on Friday, and the Saturday before found out that we were having a baby. So that added a wrench into things too. But there was, even with that, there was never any question of, am I going to still do this or not? Because it all came, it wasn't a date. It wasn't an arbitrary number. There was nothing arbitrary about it. There was very definitive. If I meet X, Y, Z criteria, I will leave. And I met that criteria. So I had no reason not to leave.
So when you're looking at cash flow and building up the passive side of things and looking at active deals, how did you start finding those opportunities to start building up that passive income? And then how did you start finding activities and opportunities to start building on the active side of things as well?
At the time, my whole approach at the beginning, and I would encourage people to take a much more educated approach to this, but my approach at the beginning was I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I looked at Charlotte and I pulled up Realtor, the app, and there were 1 million red dots for active properties. And I thought, okay, I need to whittle these down somehow. And so I started whittling them down to, and I didn't know any better at the time about off-market deals or anything like that. I was just looking on the MLS. And so I started narrowing it down until I could find just a handful of properties, not really thinking about the fact that if there's only a handful that everybody can find by adding a filter, that means that everybody's competing for them. But my first couple of deals, to answer your question, were off of the MLS. I found deals that were in pretty not good condition. And in hindsight, I understand why I was the only one that was pursuing them. For me, as a starting point, they were great. They were really rough. They required a lot of work, but they had a lot of upside to them and a lot of cash flow and a lot of equity once I did the work. So that was the initial push. And then I started connecting more. As I learned more, I started connecting with wholesalers. I started building out my network in that area. I started a meetup here in town, and I started just building up people who could provide me with deals. And then once I got to that point, that was, the same thing ended up tying in when I decided to start flipping houses. I already had the pipeline built out. I did end up going into, dovetailing into doing my own lead generation, which that was not the best thing in the world for me, but it works for a lot of people. And I should have just stuck with working with the people that do that for a living and are really good at it. But either way, that was the main thing. MLS at the very beginning, still kept an eye on the MLS after that, but didn't really get too many off of it. But then wholesalers after that were the primary way that I did it. And then I got a couple from direct to seller.
So what are you focused on now, and what are you looking to focus on in the upcoming future?
My primary focus right now has become my coaching business. I've evolved a lot over the past couple, really, especially over the past year, but over the last couple of years. And one thing that was really interesting to me, and as I mentioned before that people should have criteria before they leave, one other piece of advice and suggestion is think beyond the financial freedom date, because one thing that I didn't realize, I quit my job 2.5 years ago, and I didn't realize this until probably January or December of this past year. But my entire life leading up to when I quit my job, my entire focus and purpose in some way, shape, or form was on creating financial freedom, quote unquote, and leaving my job. That meant that once I quit my job, I had no purpose anymore. And the only purpose was survival. And if you're already in survival, then just money. And so that was why I built this flipping business that I never really cared about flipping. Flipping was just a means to generate capital. And so all of this is again, long-winded way to answer your question, but I now am focused on coaching and helping people basically do what I did. I love work. I was in the financial services, banking, and consulting industry. And so I love helping people in that industry in particular to work towards creating their financial freedom, but also at the same time, infusing the conversation about direction, purpose, and vision, and understanding where are you going long-term, so that when you do create financial freedom and when you inevitably do leave your job, that is more of a milestone as opposed to the end destination. Because if that's the end destination, you get there and you look around and your life is still the same life, but now you just don't have a job and you have all this time on your hands. If you're not happy where you are, that can make it even worse. Or you'll just look for money, or you'll look for something else, and you end up doing things that you don't necessarily want to be doing just to fill your time. So that's now the biggest thing that I really, really, really love helping people with, creating freedom while also creating vision and purpose.
So how has real estate investing impacted your life, Patrick?
It has changed it completely. I mean, I wouldn't be talking to you right now if I hadn't obviously invested in it, but I also probably would still be in my job, or some other business or something like that. But it is the most tried and true way for creating wealth. And so it was a massive wealth generator for me. And that's an entirely different topic about wealth, like the importance of wealth creation versus income creation. I got mixed up on those for a little bit, but it's invaluable. Everybody needs a place to live. There's always going to be a need for it. There's a very limited quantity of land. We're never making more of it. And housing supply, I mean, all the conversations right now we're still seeing the housing market in some places it's going a little bit down, but still doing pretty darn well due to the fact that there is a shortage of supply. So that just speaks to the quality of real estate, especially if you do it smartly. And you've got smartly, is that a word? Smarter. Yeah. It sounds better.
So what is the one thing that you know now about real estate that you wish you knew when you first started?
Good question. There's no such thing as passive income when you are actively investing in the deal. Now, if you're investing in someone else's syndication or something like that, sure, you don't have, if you're not talking to any contractor, any third party, anything like that, then yeah, absolutely. But if you actively own real estate, even if you've got a property manager, the irony and the thing that I didn't really realize at the time was having a property manager is great, except it just then elevates the level of problems that you receive. So on the most recent property I had, the only time I got phone calls was when it was an 18-unit property. Only time I got phone calls was when a $5,000 air conditioner blew up, and there were 8 of them that went bad over the course of 2 months. So that was not a passive investment. It was very active, and it was very much a headache in that regard. So I think just that myth of by having it's equating rental properties to passive income, and rental income is not passive. Rental income can be very, very active. You can make it passive through a variety of different ways in the long term, but don't go in on day one expecting that I'm going to buy 100 single family houses and that's going to be considered passive income. If anything, that's going to be a lot of work.
And what is the one thing that sets the successful people apart in real estate investing?
I think it's their tribe. I think it's the people that they have around them that provides both clarity and encouragement on where they're going. Now, I think it's almost a double-edged sword. Like the people that are the most successful, they're hyper-focused on where they're going. They know exactly what they're doing. And they've also got people around them that they're learning from, that they're pulling from, that are pushing them, that are supporting them. I think what we sometimes try to do is we see someone that's very successful, especially in real estate or something like that, and we want to emulate them, and we want to do everything that they do. And we think that in order to be where they are financially, we've got to emulate their entire life. And really, we need to look at it more as who are the series of people that each provide different things. And I was at a conference this weekend, and we had 4 different speakers that were all successful, and they each gave conflicting advice against each other. And that means there's not one of them that was right. There's what's right for you. And so I think the most successful people, I guess to answer that in 2 parts then, they surround themselves with people that push them and help them and move them forward and educate them. They also, at the same time, they're very much their own person, and they're not trying to be a mix of other people. They're very much their own person that is doing what's right for them while also pulling in the things that make the most sense.
And Patrick, where can our listeners find out more about you?
You can go to my Instagram page. It's the Patrick Menefee. Someone stole Patrick Menefee. So if that's you, please reach out to me.
That is not me. Just kidding.
And then my website, patrickmenefee.com. And you can also, Instagram is probably the best way, but website works too. And then you can reach out to me via email, patrick@investdgp.com.
All right. And Patrick, really quick also, where can our listeners find the tool that you've been working on?
It'll be on my website.
Okay.
Thank you. And I'll have a link to it on my Instagram too, but I'll have it on my website.
Awesome. Patrick, thank you so much for being on our show today. Really appreciate all you shared.
Thank you so much, Eileen. I appreciate it. It was fun.
And thank you for listening to our podcast today, brought to you by Bonavest Capital. We would really appreciate it if you can go to iTunes right now and leave a rating and written review. Also, please don't forget to subscribe so you can always get the latest episodes. You can also connect with us on Facebook, How Did They Do It Real Estate. We'd love to hear your feedback and any topics that you're interested in for future episodes. Lastly, to learn more about us, you can go to bonavestcapital.com and fill out the Contact Us page so you can speak to us directly. Nothing on the show should be considered as specific personal advice. Please consult your legal, tax, and real estate professionals for individualized advice.